Okay, let's be honest here for a moment. If you play Destiny enough to keep up with the news of the game, then you have definitely heard of the talks around the community regarding the Into the Light update, which is the new Destiny 2 free-to-play update dropping this Tuesday. One of the things that people are excited about regarding this is Destiny's first ever Horde mode being Onslaught, which will release this Tuesday. With this activity having high enemy density and escalating difficulty, I wanted to make sure that you and your fire team are ready to take this activity on day one. So today, I wanted to highlight two of the best builds to use for all three classes, so that you can conquer this activity on the 9th. As per usual with these videos, you can find the dim links for these builds in the description below. Also in the description will be the timestamps for each class, in case you just want to skip to one of the three classes. So with that being said, I'm SniperKH, and let's get into the video. To start off the video, we're going to be looking at Warlocks first. The two builds I've chosen will be able to take on adds easily whilst also giving you the tools to deal with bosses, whether that is by being one of the big damage dealers for your team or providing your team with the tools to take down the bosses easier. The first build I want to highlight is the Arc Ionic Traces build. If you've played Destiny throughout the year, then you might be familiar with this build, as it was by far the best build to use back in Season of the Deep. I've made a separate video covering this build in the past, but that video features seasonal mods that are no longer available, so I'll just go over what you need for this build again. As the build name mentions, you'll need the Arc subclass on the Warlock to make this build work. Your super, rift, glide, melee, and grenade options entirely depend on what you prefer, but I chose to run Chaos Reach, Healing Rift, Burst Glide, Ball Lightning, and Pulse Grenade. The important parts of this build lies in the aspects Fragments and Exotics. For the aspects, I chose to run Arc Soul and Electrostatic Mind. Arc Soul will give you a little arc buddy that can slay enemies and help generate ionic traces for you, and Electrostatic Mind will give you the ability to generate ionic traces with arc weapon and ability kills. For Fragments, I chose to run Spark of Beacons for the blinding effect on enemies when you get a special weapon kill, to which you'll be getting a lot of them, Spark of Amplitude for orb generation, Spark of Discharge for additional ionic traces, and Spark of Magnitude to make your grenade stronger. For exotics, I'd highly recommend Fallen Sunstar and Coldheart, as both of these exotics will increase your ionic trace generation tenfold. For mods, I'd highly recommend Ashes to Assets, Firepower, Bomber, and Powerful Attraction to elevate this build to its full potential. Using this build in add dense activities like Onslaught will prove to be highly effective, hence its appearance on today's list. The second Warlock build I wanted to highlight today will allow you to add clear effectively, give you tools to deal with bosses fairly easily, and provide your team with the tools to deal with bosses easier. The second build is the Solar Sunbracers build. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this build, as I mentioned, is that it does great with add clear, and with one of the aspects that you'll be running with this build, the solar grenades you'll be using will be fairly great for dealing with bosses. But the main focus of this build for me is that it can build Well of Radiance fast, which I predict will be really good in this activity. And yes, I know, a daring take. Anywho, for this build, you'll want the solar subclass on the Warlock. For abilities, you can run whatever rift, glide, and melee you want to run, though the incendiary snap will be the better melee to run thanks to its faster cooldown. Regarding the other abilities, you want to run Well of Radiance as it is simply the best super in the game, and solar grenades since you'll be using Sunbracers. For aspects, I'd highly recommend Icarus Dash for the additional movement, and Touch of Flame as it'll buff your solar grenades, allowing them to last longer and emit fireballs which can do more damage the higher they fall. For Fragments, I'd recommend Ember of Mercy for the ability to get restoration from fire spites and revives, Ember of Empyrean to increase the timer of your restoration and radiant buffs, Ember of Souls to further increase restoration and radiance buff timers, and Ember of Searing to give yourself the ability to generate fire spites off of scorched enemy kills. For exotics, the only necessary one will be Sunbracers, though for exotic weapons, I'd recommend Sunshot for a consistent hand cannon, Gallahorn for the wolf backgrounds, and for an overall strong rocket launcher. And if you're running this activity solo, then might I suggest Dragon's Breath. I know Dragon's Breath might seem like a ridiculous recommendation, but it could work really well alongside this build and Onslaught. Regarding mods, you'll find the most effective mods to be Ashes to Assets, Firepower, Momentum Transfer, Invigoration, Bomber, and Powerful Attraction. Using this build in Onslaught will ensure that you are a reliable ad clearer for your team in this activity, while also providing well in order to take down bosses faster and to keep your team alive. Regardless of which Warlock build you choose, I guarantee you will find them both effective. We now move on to Hunters. For Hunters, I took a slightly different approach for choosing the two builds to recommend, as for Warlocks they can both ad clear and do damage to bosses fairly well, but the two builds I'll be showcasing for Hunters are mainly used for one of those two purposes only. That said, we open this segment with the Strand Beyblade build. Now this build might seem like an interesting pick and you might point towards some other builds that have more potential, but I wanted to highlight this build as I think it has some really good potential. The idea behind choosing this build is that it'll allow you to cover multiple ad spawns by yourself, as you can focus on one lane yourself while you have your Strand Beyblade focusing on another. Anywho, for the build you can use whatever dodge or grenade that you'd like to use, though I'd recommend Gambler's Dodge and Suspend Grenades. For aspects, I'd recommend Ensnaring Slam and Whirling Maelstrom, as Ensnaring Slam will let you deal with champs a bit easier, and Whirling Maelstrom will give you access to the Strand Beyblades. For fragments, I'd recommend Thread of Transmutation to let you create tangles a bit easier, Thread of Rebirth to spawn threadlings, especially since they're stronger in PvE now, Thread of Warding to give you access to Woven Mail, and Thread of Wisdom so that you can build your abilities and get Woven Mail easily, since you'll be using Suspend Grenades. For exotics, I'd highly recommend the 6 Coyote to gain an additional dodge for the suspending effect, and Quicksilver Storm, as it will pair really well with this build despite the nerf it will be getting with the Into the Light patch. For mods, I'd highly recommend Strand Siphon, Heavy Handed, Focusing Strike, Impact Induction, Innervation, Orbs of Restoration, Bomber, and Powerful Attraction. Using this combination of mods and weapons with this build will let you become a powerful ad clearer for your team, which will work perfectly in Onslaught. For the second build, I wanted to cover the Arc Hunter melee build. I'm choosing to recommend this build as while it does have more value as a bossing build, it actually does really well for ad clear as well. Regarding the subclass layout, you can run whatever jump and grenade you'd like to, though I'd highly recommend you run pulse grenades. For the rest of the layout, I'd recommend Gathering Storm for a strong super, Gambler's Dodge to get your melee back faster, and Combination Blow for a stronger melee. For aspects, I'd recommend Flow State to give you an easy access to Amplified, and Lethal Current to get you access to an even stronger melee, which will make this build stronger. For the fragments, I'd recommend Spark of Resistance as you'll be given damage resistance when surrounded by targets, which happens very often with this build. Spark of Shock to make your grenade stronger, Spark of Ions in order to give your abilities back faster, and Spark of Feedback to make your melee do additional damage when you take melee damage. For exotics, I'd recommend either Assassin's Cowl for ad clear or Liar's Handshake for bossing, and Tractor Cannon to make taking tankier bosses down a lot easier. Regarding mods, you'll want Hands On, Heavy Handed, Innervation, Recuperation, Orbs of Restoration, Bomber, and Powerful Attraction. Using this build in Onslaught will give you access to not only a strong bossing build, but also a really strong ad clearer build, which will make it fit perfectly in the activity. Alright, we are now onto Titans. Picking the 2 Titan builds was fairly easy, as we're just going to stick with the 2 strong picks for Titans. The first build is one that has dominated the game since its inception last season, as the first pick is the Banner of War Strand build. Let's be honest for a second, did you really think I was going to recommend another build first for Titans? Because if so, I need to question whether or not you actually play Titan. This build is amazing for several reasons, and while I have covered this build extensively, I'll make this overview quick. For the subclass layouts, you'll want grapple grenades, and while the barricade doesn't really matter, I'd recommend Tower Barricade. For aspects, you'll obviously want Banner of War and Into the Fray, as these 2 aspects make this build. For fragments, I'd recommend Thread of Fury for melee regeneration on Tangle Destruction, Thread of Warding for another source of Woven Mail, Thread of Transmutation to have another source of Tangles, and Thread of Generation to get your grenades back faster. Regarding exotics, I'd recommend either Worm God's Caress or Syntheseps for the armor, depending on your preference, and Tractor Cannon to make this build even stronger. For mods, I'd recommend Hands On, Heavy Handed, Impact Induction, Recuperation, Invigoration, Orbs of Restoration, Outreach, and Bomber. Using these mods will make this build unstoppable, though I'm sure that with the number of videos that I and other Destiny creators have made for this build, that should tell you all that you need to know. For the final Titan build and final build in general for this video, we have an old but classic build in that of the Solar Bonk Hammer. Now, some of you might be looking at me sideways for this recommendation, so allow me to explain why I chose this build. Whilst this is the weaker of the 2 popular Titan melee builds, thanks to the nerf this build received going into the season, it is still a great option. It just requires a few more brain cells to use properly. For the subclass layout, I'd recommend Hammer of Soul for the super, Towering Barricade, and Healing Grenades. For the aspects, I'd recommend Roaring Flames for the stronger melee, and Sol Invictus for the heal thanks to Sunspots. For fragments, I'd recommend Ember of Mercy for the access to restoration from fire spites, Ember of Torches for the access to Radiant, Ember of Searing for the access to fire spites, and Ember of Empyrean to extend the timer of restoration and radiant thanks to solar weapon and ability kills. For exotics, I'd recommend either Loreley Splendor for the emergency health, Precious Scars for the easy access to restoration from weapon kills, or one of the 2 Titan melee exotics and that of Wormgod's Caress or Syntheseps. And for the weapon, I'd highly recommend Tractor Cannon to buff this build even further. For mods, I'd recommend Hands-On, Heavy-Handed, Impact Induction, Invigoration, Recuperation, Orb of Restoration, Outreach, and Bomber. Using this combination of mods and weapons will bring this build close to its former glory, and while it won't be as strong, it'll still be a strong build, which is why it's on today's list. Well, that'll wrap up today's video. If you found it helpful, then consider dropping a like and subscribing to the channel for more Destiny content dropping soon. If you have some content you'd like for me to cover going into the Light, then be sure to drop a comment and I'll be sure to get to it. Also, if you want to do some Onslaught runs with me, then stay tuned as I'm trying to get my stream up and running for Onslaught's launch, so be on the lookout for that. If you'd like updates on when I go live or upload new videos, then be sure to check out my social media platforms linked in the description below. With that being said, I'm SniperKH, and I'm out. Good luck with gaming.